Hey y'all, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read during the month of January. This is sort of an impromptu video. My husband got home from work early and I thought, hey, can you take the kids for a minute so that I can get a video done? He said yes, so hopefully I can get my thoughts together on all the books that I finished up reading this month. If you're new here, my name's Haley. I usually share homeschooling related content on this channel, but I am a big reader and I feel like a lot of my subscribers probably are too, just because of the type of homeschooling content that I share. A lot of it is like literature based. So I thought I would start doing an end of the month reading wrap up just to share some book recommendations with you guys. Aside from homeschooling curriculum, books are another thing that I love to talk about. I do read a wide range of genres in books, but I do try to stick to mostly clean books or Christian fiction. So whenever I say mostly clean, that just means that they're not filled with excessive language or explicit relationships. There will still be some content in the books that are probably, hard to handle situations or sad situations, but those scenarios are more so just part of the character development and not so much like a glorified part of the story, if that makes sense. So with all of that said, let's jump into first the one book that I did not finish this month. It was actually part of a series and it was the 5th book in the Timeless series by Gabrielle Meyer. So I have read the first 4 books in this series and I enjoyed them somewhat. The first book I enjoyed, second book I enjoyed, third and fourth book were just kind of meh for me. So I borrowed this one on audiobook and I don't know. I think I'm over the series as a whole. I'm not really wanting to continue it. I'm just not that interested in it anymore. Like I said, the 3rd and 4th book in the series were kind of the same way for me. I had to force myself to finish them. I just wasn't attached to any of the characters and the storylines were just okay for me. If you're not familiar with it, these are dual timeline Christian fiction where the character in the story actually has the ability to time cross between multiple timelines. And yeah, this one I think I'm done with the series. So I did not finish that one. That's the one book that I started this month and ended up setting to the side, and I don't know that I'll come back to it in the future. I'm going to pull up the rest of the books that I finished on my Goodreads account. So the next book that I finished was also a series that I started this month, and I read the first 2 books in the series, and that is Winter's Maiden by Morgan L. Busey. These are fantasy books, and I'm always a little hesitant going into a fantasy book just because, as you well know, fantasy books have a tendency to be very explicit, especially with a lot of the popular fantasy series out there right now. So I'm always just very hesitant going into a fantasy series, but I'm pretty positive that this is actually Christian fantasy, and I did not realize that going into it. So the first book, I found myself very reserved as I was reading through it because I was too afraid, I think, to get attached to the storyline too much and then have some type of questionable content come up and have to set it aside. So the first book was just like a 3-star read for me. I still enjoyed it enough to want to pick up the second book, especially because by the second half of the book, it became apparent to me that this was going to have Christian themes in it. So I feel like once I came to that realization at the end of the first book, I was able to enjoy the second book more because I was not just waiting for, something to drop and me have to put the series aside. But in this story, you're following a girl named Bridget. The story starts out with her birth and her mother actually passing away during delivery. And then she is brought up by the woman who was the midwife at her delivery. They live in a place called Nordica, and they are divided into different clans within this world, and they are actually on the cusp of a war. There is a lot of just tension between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. In the midst of all this, Bridget becomes aware of a special ability that she has and ends up joining the fight for Nordica. Towards the second half of the first book, you do also get introduced to a male main character, so you get his perspective. So it ends up being kind of like a dual perspective throughout the second book. And overall, like I said, I just enjoyed this series. It was full of like winter atmosphere. It's very cold where they are. And it was just overall a good fantasy read. I like a good clean fantasy. I gave the first book 3 stars and then the second book 4 stars, and I will definitely continue on with this. I'm not sure if it's a trilogy or if there's going to be more, but I know there's definitely a 3rd book coming based on how the second one ended. Okay, next I have a book that is actually a children's fiction book that I read aloud to my 2 boys, and it is called Winter Frost. This was just an overall fun story to enjoy reading to my children. You follow a girl named Bettina, and it is based around a Danish folklore of Nisse, which are these tiny people who live in the forest. And the Danish tradition is that they are to leave a bowl of porridge out for their Nisse. Well, Bettina's family forgets to leave out the bowl of porridge on Christmas Eve, and her Nisse is angry and he makes a bad choice. And then the storyline is just following Bettina as she comes into contact with the tiny Nisse people, and they are trying to right the wrong that their Nisse made whenever he was angry. So like I said, it was a fun story to read with my boys. It was a little slow at times. I think I ended up giving this one like a 3-star rating, but it was just a cozy read to enjoy with your kids in a fantasy world. And it was fun to learn about some of the traditions or folklore of another place. Next up, we have a classic. It is called The Warden by Anthony Trollope. This is my 2nd book by Anthony Trollope to read that I have just thoroughly enjoyed. In this story, you are following Mr. Harding, who is the warden of an almshouse, and his income from working for this charity house comes into question. So he's receiving quite a substantial amount of income that he just began receiving whenever he took up this position, and he never really questioned it much. It was just what was done by those in the position prior to him. But now it has been brought to the attention of this activist, and he is questioning the amount of money that Mr. Harding is receiving. Mr. Harding is reassured by the Archbishop and the Bishop that his income is justified and not to worry about it, that any investigations will be put to rest, that he doesn't need to worry about it. So he's basically being told that as long as everybody thinks that what you're doing is okay, then that makes it okay. But he is very concerned that he wants to truly do what is right. So he doesn't just care about what others perceive to be right and wrong, but he wants to make sure that he is truly doing what he is meant to be doing, that he's truly not receiving more than he should be receiving, and that those funds are being used properly and for the care of the poor who have been placed into this charity home. So Mr. Harding, through and through, lovable, a wonderful character. I ended up giving this one 5 stars, and one of my favorite quotes in here was just short and sweet, and it has to do with whenever Mr. Harding makes a decision and he is told to not be rash about it, to really stop and to think this through, think about all of the things that are going to happen because of this decision he is making. They're calling it rash, and he simply says it can never be rash to do right. So he was just dedicated to doing the right thing. Absolutely love this story, and I can't wait to read more of Anthony Trollope's books. Next book I have is another Christian fiction, and it is The Bell Tolls at Traeger Hall by Jamie Jo Wright. I always enjoy Jamie Jo Wright's books. I like the dual timeline. I feel like she usually weaves both timelines together wonderfully, but this one was just not a favorite of mine. I don't know what it was about it. I just didn't connect with either of the characters in either timeline very much, or the story, which was disappointing to me because I really love a story based around a house. I've just always loved books that have like a big house in it. I don't know, that's been since I was a child reading books. If there's a big house with unique architecture, I'm usually intrigued by the story, but this one just fell kind of flat for me. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. It wasn't bad by any means. It was just okay. And I can usually tell a book is just okay for me if whenever I go to talk about it, I have a hard time recalling what actually happened in the storyline. So I actually had to read the synopsis for this one again to kind of remind myself what the story was about. And I just feel like whenever a story's like really a favorite, that it sticks with me and I remember so many of the little details. But basically in this one, you have the past timeline in the late 1800s. There is a girl living there with her aunt and uncle, and he actually ends up being murdered in his home, as well as his wife. And in this house that he lives in, he had this bell installed. And he always said that whenever something happened to him, they needed to run and ring this bell. That's what happens on the night that he is murdered. And then you go forward to the current timeline, and you have a girl who inherits Traeger Hall, which is the place where this man and his wife were murdered back in the late 1800s. It has been locked up for all these years. Nobody's been inside of it. So there's all these secrets surrounding it. That was actually in the will of the uncle, that whenever something happened to him, that the house was to be boarded up and nobody was to go into it for 100 years. So as Jamie Jo Wright usually does, she weaves the storylines together, and in the current timeline, you are answering some of the unsolved questions from the past timeline about what happened surrounding this event. I don't really know why I didn't enjoy this one as much as I have some of the previous books that I've read by Jamie Jo Wright. Usually her books are like a solid 4-star for me. I think I just had a really hard time believing the fact that this house had been locked up for 100 years and nobody had broken into it to figure out what was going on with it, and that it hadn't been, publicly broadcasted everywhere. I feel like in the area that I live in, somebody's going to break into this house. I just don't feel like anybody is going to have a house sitting boarded up with all these secrets surrounding it and nobody's going to break into it for 100 years. So maybe that's why I struggled with this one a little bit. So kind of unfortunate that I didn't enjoy this one as much as I have some of her previous books, but that's okay. We'll try it on the next one. The next book is the second book in a series that I actually gave 5 stars to the first book in the series last year. So this is book number 2 in the Dread Penny Society by Sarah Eden. This one is called The Gentleman and the Thief. And I listened to this one on audiobook. I would say it's probably like a 3.5 star. I think I gave it 4 stars over on Goodreads. I just rounded it up. But this takes place in London in the mid 1800s, I believe. And there is a secret society that you learn about in the first book of the series, and it's called the Dread Penny Society. The people within this society are writing penny dreadfuls. If you don't know what a penny dreadful is, this was a piece of literature that was published around this time period, and they were published in installments. And they were all horror based, so very kind of creepy stories that were pushed out during this time period. They were considered for the lower class. They weren't considered, proper for the upper class to be reading these low class pieces of literature. But the people who are within this Dread Penny Society, they are all writing stories, all writing penny dreadfuls, and they're using the money that they get from selling these stories to do good work within London. So they are reaching out to the poor, the impoverished, children who are being mistreated, and they are trying to provide refuge for them through this money that they're making. I think these are considered romance, but I'll be honest, I'm not really here for the romance so much as I am just the time setting and the work of the secret society. So you do have a romance in all of these books. I'm pretty sure it says proper romance on the cover. Like I said, I'm more interested in the Dread Penny Society and the work they're doing, as well as the excerpts that you get from the Penny Dreadfuls. So that's what I really enjoy about this series, is that every so many chapters, you'll actually get an excerpt from one of the Penny Dreadful stories that these characters are supposedly writing. So you get like 3 stories in one book. I don't know, it's a fun time. So like I said, I gave it 3.5 stars. I'll probably continue on with book number 3 in this series. They are just a fun read. Okay, I'm going to give a little disclaimer on the next book before I talk about it, just because I've talked about so many proper romance and Christian fiction up until this point. This book is not Christian fiction. It is clean in the sense that it is not filled with excessive language or any explicit scenes. However, it does have quite a few content warnings. There are some people who have some very disturbing habits or secrets. Just know that going into this one, that this one does have some dark themes to it. So the book that I'm talking about is called The Forgotten Garden by Kate Morton. This is the third book of Kate Morton's that I have read, and I just love how she layers her stories. I love the depth that goes into it. I feel like there is just so much detail and so many different perspectives in her story that you just feel like you really understand exactly what is happening. The story starts in the late 1800s when a little girl shows up all alone on a ship in Australia. She has nothing with her except for a suitcase that has this book of fairy tales tucked inside of it. The man who's working at the shipyard sees the little girl sitting out there. She's like 4 years old. He takes her home and to his wife, and they raise this little girl as their own. He expected somebody to kind of show up the next day or within a couple of days and say, hey, there's a child missing, but nobody ever shows up. So they just take this little girl in and start to raise her as their own. But then you flash forward to whenever Nell, that was the little girl's name, is in her early to mid 20s, and she's actually about to get married, and her father lets her know her true origin story, that they are not her biological parents, that she was just found whenever she was very young. And that just kind of sets her on this downward spiral of not feeling like she actually belongs where she is at. She's wondering who her family was, how she ended up where she ended up at. But then the storyline moves way into the future, and you have Nell actually on her deathbed, and she passes away and leaves to her granddaughter a home that she purchased on the Cornish coast. Her granddaughter has absolutely no idea what this property is. Her grandmother has never told her anything about having this home. She's never told her anything about her history. And so she decides to go actually to where this home is to try to get some answers, because she's completely confused on what this property is, why her grandmother left it to her. And so throughout the story, you are just following Cassandra, who is her granddaughter, as she goes back to this home to try to answer all these questions that she has about her grandmother's family and her history. You also get another perspective from a woman named Eliza Makepeace, and she was actually the author of the book of fairy tales that was in the suitcase that Nell showed up with whenever she was a little girl. There's a lot of betrayal, there's jealousy, there's heartbreak, loss. They're not light reads. Like, I can't say that these books are just like a fun read like a lot of the other books that I said, but these stories always stick with me. But I definitely have to be in the mood. I know that now, reading a Kate Morton book after the first two that I read, I knew that this was going to be a deep read, and that there were going to be strong emotions and strong feelings, and that it was not all going to be wrapped up with a little bow on top as a happy ending. But I want to read through all of her books, because so far, all three that I have read, I have thoroughly enjoyed. They've hit me hard. Whenever I finish them up, I'm affected by them, and I just really enjoy them. So I'm going to continue to read her books. I don't know that she has any new books out. I don't know that she's still writing. I don't know. I'm not familiar with her as an author. But let's move on to the final book that I completed in the month of January. And I selected this book because one of my goals for this year is to go through the book list that the Literary Life podcast has done episodes on, and start going through those books and reading like one a month, and then listening to all the episodes that they have on it. I haven't listened to the podcast episode for this book yet, but it was Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile. I actually had a physical copy of that one here at the house, so I thought I would start there. But I gave this one 4 stars. Agatha Christie books are generally enjoyable. I will say that this one felt much more psychological than the previous books of hers that I have read. There was just definitely a sense, obviously a murder always has some type of psychological things going on, but this one, it just felt much more in your face in the way that the characters said things. They were just so many characters just openly discussing murder like it was, you know, just something that it's okay to be very casual talking about. So this book, obviously, Death on the Nile, takes place on the Nile River in Egypt on a cruise ship. The young newlywed woman ends up shot on the ship. There is a large cast of characters in this book, so it can be a little bit confusing to keep up with who's who. There were a couple that I just had totally mixed up at one point, but this was the first Agatha Christie book that I actually got right. In one aspect of it, at least. There ends up being multiple layers to the mystery in this one. But I did get one aspect of it right, and that's the first time I've ever got anything right when I'm reading an Agatha Christie book. But I don't feel like you can say too much without giving things away. But young, married woman, very wealthy, ends up shot on a ship. And it took a little while though on this one. There's a lot of build up to the actual murder in this book. So it doesn't happen right at the beginning. I want to say it's like halfway into the story. So there's a lot of lead up to it, just getting to know these different people who are going to end up being in the cast of characters. And overall, a fun read. And I can't wait to go back and listen to the Literary Life podcast. I have another book that I've also started already, but I won't have finished by the end of this month, that also goes along with the Literary Life podcast episodes. So that is it. That's all the books that I actually finished this month. I have a lot of other books that I'm in the middle of, so I'll include those in my reading wrap up for the month of February. So check back at the end of the next month. I can talk about all of those different books. Let me know down in the comments what you guys have been reading and enjoying. I always love a good book recommendation, and I will see you next time.